Part 4, we're back. It's only been, 2 years. Well, the last time I was on this thing, we did a pretty rough fit up on the body, but this time we're going to get it as close as we can to doing a test drive, and we should be able to drive it around the block by the end of the episode. In the last episode, I mentioned how bad the rust was on the Subaru. That needs to be addressed before we can finally drop the body on. The main spots I'm focusing right now are the 2 spots in the rear. These spots used to be where the back of the seat would mount to the shock tower. Patching that is pretty easy, so we can pretty quickly move on to lowering the body down. The fitment from last time was pretty good, so there isn't any trimming we need to do. It's all just about lining the body up, making sure it's centered left to right, front to back. Putting the body on is the easy part. The harder part is getting the hood fit up. There's a lot that needs to be trimmed. You can see that the hood kind of clears. It's far from being as low as it needs to go, so we're going to start by cutting the upper radiator support off and seeing how much clearance that gives us. I know it's kind of hard to see in the video, but the hood is hitting the oil fill port, the dipstick, and I know on the way down it's going to hit even more. There's also definitely not enough clearance in the front to get the radiator up there, so it's going to end up having to go in the back. But we'll get back to the hood fit up later with the new fiberglass hood. The next step is to start getting the 2 welded together. Now there's a bunch of holes between the 2 different bodies that need to be patched. I've already tacked the front, so we're going to start making plates for the rear. The old firewall in the Beetle was rotten out, so it needs to be replaced. Most of the body I'm going to be using 16 gauge steel for everything. That's going to be plenty strong. In this area, I ran out of 16 gauge and I had to use 1/8 inch. So this area is definitely going to be strong. I just have to finish welding it. I'll do that in a later part. All the little patches you see me put in, that's 16 gauge. Once the back is braced, I can start moving on to the front. The biggest thing is Subaru put a lot of their accessories on the inside of the engine bay on the wheel wells, and those all need to be trimmed back. The ABS pump needs to be moved, the air filter needs to be moved, and the battery box needs to be moved. For now, that's all just going to be cut out, but I need to brace the front first. I throw a pretty simple brace in here just to keep the shock towers from moving while I'm cutting everything. I took some very rough measurements on the underside of the hood to see where exactly I needed to trim. I know in the end I'm going to have to trim more, and you'll see I trim a lot more than what I do. And also knowing that the front radiator isn't going to fit, I have to cut the front sections of frame rail off, which also hold the front radiator lower support. That comes off pretty easily with 2 cuts. So with all the front now being trimmed, we can go and grab the hood. The initial fit up is not very promising, but I figured nothing was going to fit anyway, and I'm not scared to cut right into this hood. I do start with some very small cuts. I want to remove as little as possible to leave as much of the original look of the hood as I can. I was hoping that the front pulleys wouldn't hit, but it looks like the alternator, the power steering, the AC, and the power steering reservoir all hit right at the very nose of the hood. I tried to keep it as small as possible, but it wasn't really possible. So I'm showing you the rough finish for the hood. The hood still needs to be dropped down a good 3 inches, which means that the hole is going to get bigger. If you notice, the wheel is not centered in the fender. This is still a rough fit up. The hood does need to be dropped a few inches. So now that the front hood is roughly fit up, I can start working on the rear fenders. I only had to make 1 small cut to clear the shock. Eventually, I will be plating the whole outside of that area to make it a little smoother, and I'll potentially be putting a cap in there. It is fairly hidden, the shock. I know it's popping right through the side of the body, but it's really not too noticeable. I mean, really, it is pretty noticeable, but considering that these two were never meant to be together, I can live with a little bit of shock popping through the top. The process ends up being the same on both sides. It was pretty straightforward and pretty quick to get together. Something that gets a little more complicated is the fuel management system. I'm trying to leave the original Subaru fuel sending unit and fuel pump that are left in the tank. I just have to run new lines. It turns out all the factory lines were rotten anyway, so the second I started moving them around, they started breaking off. The area between the tank and the body is too tight to fit any new lines in there that are bent. In order to get this done as fast as possible, I chose to run the fuel lines inside of the car, just like the factory Subaru had. The only difference is I am running rubber line that goes from the tank to the underside of the car, where I am using hard line. These lines are really rough. There needs to be some sort of keeper that goes from the tank to the inside of the car to both keep it insulated from the outside and to keep it from rubbing on the steel. I will be putting clips in after to tie everything down, as well as a shield, but for the time being, this is sufficient to get it down the street. The only quick thing about doing this fuel system was relocating the filter. There was an existing bolt hole on the motor I was able to move the bracket to. The only other thing I did in this area was rerun the brakes. Those were pretty straightforward, all new nickel copper going from front to back. I am going to have to run new lines anyway for the ABS pump wherever I end up relocating it. And with that, we're able to move on to the first start since the body's been on it. I don't know if you heard that, but I'm going to play the sound of the motor starting again. I don't know if you can hear it, but it sounds like it's only running on a few cylinders, and then it catches up, and then there's a big bang. It also wouldn't stay running on its own. We had to keep the throttle going the full time, but we'll get back to why in a second. Now, off camera, I ended up putting side plates and a cowl in to strengthen up that whole front section. I'm attaching my steering wheel brace to those side plates, which will eventually be connected to the shock towers. The brace going from that tube down to the steering wheel is really quick and dirty, but it works and the steering wheel is nice and straight. The steering wheel looks like it's off-centered to where the original Beetle instrument cluster was, but it's actually centered on the rest of those gauge panels. So when I put the original Subaru gauge cluster in, everything will be centered. And this also means I don't have to move the steering wheel lower mount over any. So back on to why it didn't run right. I was trying to figure this out for a really long time. I asked one of my buddies to come over with a scan tool and plug it in and see if something wasn't communicating, if it was misfiring, if the timing was off. And he looked at me and said, "How old is the gas?" So this is what the gas ended up looking like. It was completely brown and smelled like varnish. So that got drained, and I put some fresh gas in it, and the thing fired right up first try. I had to move a bunch of stuff out of the way to get this thing out. One last thing I forgot to mention was that I did the rear drive shaft off camera. I had to remove about 6 inches of material. The balancing is probably not correct, but those Subaru drive shafts are not serviceable. So I'm going to have to pick up a new drive shaft and shorten that one anyway. So this is fine for a test drive. This thing has been sitting in the back of my shop for about 2 years at this point, so it's nice to finally see it moving. This was footage from me actually pulling it out and driving it for the first time since it's been parked. This is just like driving the square body.
much. It's a good runner.
The wind noise at this point is too bad to understand anything, but there's only minor squeaks and rattles. Those are just from the fenders not being fully bolted down. The body feels pretty stiff, though I will be adding more braces that go from the shock tower down to a subframe. After that initial run, I got a little more confident in the car and I did some higher speed runs. The car feels pretty quick, but it also doesn't have a windshield, so it feels like I'm driving a motorcycle. I got up to a max speed of 40 in these clips, and the car felt really good. I also forgot to record putting a temporary radiator mount in the front. It will be mounted in the rear, but for the test drive, we're just keeping it in the front. So that's it for this part. On the next part, I'd like to get the hood fully set up, and I'd like to finish welding all of the interior parts. Hopefully I can finish the subframe too. Hopefully the next part will take less than 2 years to get out to you guys. But the main reason for me wanting to get the car to this point is because my father has a Studebaker truck that I have to do a bunch of work to. So the Beetle has to go to their house, and I have to take the truck in here. So the Beetle's going to be parked for a couple months while I'm finishing that, and then I'll get right back to it. Thank you guys for sticking with me through this time. I hope to see you on the next part, and don't forget to like and subscribe.